Whether we are swimming or whether we are walking on water, it's the faith in God that's important when we are in the water. In the ever-shifting water of the river of this life, I was swimming, seeking comfort. I was wrestling waves to find a boulder I could cling to, a stone to hold me fast, where I might let the fretful of this river round me pass. And so I found an anchor, a blessed resting place, a trusty rock I called my Savior, for there I would be safe. From the river and its dangers I proclaimed my rock divine. I prayed to it protect me, and the rock replied, God is a river, not just a stone. God is a wild raging rapids and a slow meandering flow. God is a deep and narrow passage and a peaceful sandy shore. God is the river swimmer. So let go. Still I clung to my rock tightly with conviction in my arm, never looking at the stream to keep my mind from thoughts of harm. But the river kept on coming, kept on tugging at my legs, till at last my fingers faltered and I was swept away. So I'm going with the flow now, these relentless twists and bends, acclimating to the motion and a sense of being led. And this river's like my body now, it carries me along through the ever-changing scenes and by the rocks that sing this song. God is a river, not just a stone. God is a wild raging rapids and a slow meandering flow. God is a deep and narrow passage and a peaceful sandy shore. God is the river swimmer. So let go. God is the river swimmer. So let go. God is the river swimmer. So let go.
Friends, would you join me again in hearing these words from the Gospel of Matthew, beginning with verse 22, and rowboating is optional. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught Peter. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And then when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Friends, this is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, this morning I've been thinking a lot about all those clever, idiomatic expressions that you've always heard your whole life, but when you were a kid, they made absolutely no sense at all. Things like having your cake and eating it too, or the early bird gets the worm. Or when asked, how does one know who the right person to marry is, are told, you'll just know when you know. Now, admittedly, some of these make a lot more sense as you get older, and some of them are still rather confusing. Having moments where things are said to you that don't really make a lot of sense recalls for me an experience I had my freshman year at the University of Georgia. When I arrived on campus, I got pretty immediately plugged into a campus ministry there called the Baptist Student Union. And I got to attend worship on Tuesday nights with my peers, and I joined a Bible study group that was for the people that lived on the same part of campus that I did. We all lived on the Myers Quad. This was the first time I really remember studying the Bible with any depth on my own, pondering the words and wondering what exactly they meant and what it meant for me. I also remember one experience in that Bible study, probably towards the end of my freshman year, and I had some questions. I had some curiosities. I was like, this doesn't really make sense to me. And I remember my Bible study leader immediately shutting those questions down. Well, Lisa, if you just had enough faith, then you wouldn't be asking any of these questions. Now, I remember having a lot of those conversations with my peers while I was in undergrad, and I always found it deeply frustrating. They made it sound so easy. Just have more faith, Lisa. And I was like, well, how? How does one get that? Do I just go buy it at the store? Is there some secret thing that I'm supposed to be doing that no one has told me about? How does one have more faith? And why do you think that my questions are the opposite of that? Now, further down the road, I realized that shutting down the questions of others is a strategy that we find a lot in American Christianity, especially those who hold to the ideas of the prosperity gospel, which is very, very rampant across our country. The prosperity gospel focuses on telling people God is always going to give you only the good things, health and wealth and answers to every question you could ever possibly have, all the good things that life has to offer. Which sounds really nice, but doesn't always match what life is really like, is it? Furthermore, this way of thinking goes, if that is not your experience, if you experience pain
or suffering or doubts or questions of any kind, then there's something terribly, deeply wrong with you. Proponents of the prosperity gospel teach and cajole others into believing that the biggest questions we have about God and Jesus and our faith are signs that we don't really believe, or that we're not good enough, or that we've somehow displeased God. In 2026, we have a really helpful vocabulary word that tells us what this kind of teaching is: religious gaslighting. So here's my wondering this morning. What if hearing a statement that makes no sense to you in the moment, like some of the things we heard Jesus say into this morning's text, causes us to be curious? What if asking questions, raising doubts, is in fact an essential part of our faith becoming our own, of growing, of developing? And what if our faith cannot do those things, grow and develop, until and unless we're willing to voice our questions and doubts? What if God beckons us to risk our faith for the beckoning of doubts and questions? Now, I know as we read this morning's story from the Gospel of Matthew, no doubt many of you thought, yes, I have heard this story before. It is a popular choice for preachers and scripture teachers of all kinds. And as we dive into it a little bit today, I want to first of all say there are so many things happening in this story that we could spend a lot of time talking about. For example, we could talk about how this story is not unique to Matthew. We also find a version of Jesus walking on the water in Mark and John, suspiciously absent in Luke. All immediately happened following the feeding of the 5,000. So at the beginning of the story, when Jesus is like, y'all go on ahead, I'm going to tell these people to leave, that's like the miracle of feeding 5,000 people with a couple of loaves of bread and a couple of fish. Now, we could, and part of me wants to, go back and forth between all the different versions and talk about what's the same and what's different, but I'm not going to do that to you, friends, this morning. We don't have hours, after all. Another direction of our conversation this morning could focus on the recognition that Matthew's writing was very intricate and intentional, the way these stories were captured, because the overall arc of the Gospel of Matthew mirrors what happens to God's people in the wilderness in Exodus. And you may or may not know that I'm a big fan of all things Old Testament, so I would really love to go here and hang out here for a while. But for now, I will only, I will limit my words. Remember Moses in the desert and the burning bush, and God says, I am who I am. We have Jesus using that same language to identify himself in that experience in the wild, chaotic sea. And we have this calling of Jesus for Peter to come. Come and do what? Come to call and worship God, which is exactly what God's people were called to do when they first came out of Egypt. I like to think that Peter was daring Jesus here to show himself, to do something wild and unexpected, so that Peter could know for surezies that this was, in fact, Jesus. Or was Jesus issuing a deeper call here than the obvious literal one of stepping out of the boat? Is this an example of Jesus calling Peter to newness of life? Or was Jesus simply accepting Peter's dare? I know I can hear myself in Peter's statement, all right, God, well, if this is really you calling me right now, then I need you to do something really out of the ordinary, something wild and unexpected, so I know for sure, clearly this is you, because it couldn't have been anything else. Anyone else ever thought that way? Yeah. Which is also reminiscent of God's people out in Exodus, in the wilderness, asking for miracles already, so we know that you're with us still, God. And then just as we saw in Exodus in the wilderness wanderings, Jesus is right there, reaching out with his hand to save Peter, attentive to Peter's visceral human needs, to be rescued from the strong winds and the waves battering all around him. Now, there's no pillar of cloud by day or a pillar of fire by night as the people had as they were walking through the wilderness, but instead Jesus is physically present right there, grasping Peter's hand and leading him back to the boat and to safety. Another choice for our discussion this morning could focus on, how exactly did they walk on the water anyways, especially Jesus? But I'm pretty sure we could find books and books and books that have been written about this. But since none of the gospel writers seem terribly concerned with this, we're just going to have to put a pin in that for today, friends. Instead, what Matthew is trying to help us understand is who exactly this Jesus is, who Jesus is revealed to be. And so there are two particular rich details that I want us to lock in on together this morning. The first, as intriguing as the whole Jesus walking on water thing is, and our desire to parse it endlessly, it's not in there for scientific proof. It's not in there as a detail so that we can spend hours and days and weeks and months and years debating if this is scientifically possible. As all the gospel writers share this story, their collective wisdom is that walking on water is merely a skill that is attributable to Jesus because Jesus is God. That's it. Psalm 77, Job 9, verse 8, both talk about how God walks on water. So anyone familiar with the Jewish canon in this day and time would have heard this story and said, oh, walking on water? Jesus is God? What? Only God treads on the waves of the sea. So Jesus demonstrates his divine authority here by walking on the water. The second rich detail that we need to pay attention to, I've mentioned already, is when Jesus calls out at the beginning to calm the fears of his disciples, he uses that language, ego eimi, which is translated, I am, which immediately tells us, okay, there's a little something extra going on here. It's not just, hey, dude, it's me, Jesus. This is a theophany, a God sighting, a moment when the disciples clearly see exactly who Jesus is. But despite that clarity in expression about who he is in that moment, it doesn't seem like the disciples fully understand all of what they're observing, which is understandable. They're in a boat that's rocking and roaring in the wind and the waves. Their fear is getting the better of them in that moment. Instead of registering, Jesus is God, they assume they're seeing a ghost and they're terrified. Jesus recognized this is what was happening with his disciples, and so he spoke to them so they could hear his familiar voice. Take courage, it's me, don't be afraid. Now, this is where Matthew's version of this story is really different from what we read in Mark and John. In their rendering of the pericope, we aren't told how the disciples respond to these assurances because the next thing we know, Jesus is climbing over in the boat, grasping the hands of someone to help him get over the side. But Matthew's really different. It takes an unexpected turn. We've got Peter saying, all right, Jesus, if it's really you out there, just tell me to come out to you on the water. It kind of reminds me of the Christmas story and the double dog daring that the boys do on the playground. So Peter is reaching out to this unknown entity on behalf of his friends, the disciples, being upfront with what he needs to be convinced that this is really Jesus. He's expressing his uncertainty and his doubt and his skepticism from the moment he opens his mouth. right? Jesus accepts the terms of the dare and says, come on then. And Peter decides to risk it, risk his doubts, and steps out of the boat and onto the water, walking towards Jesus on the sea. After an unnamed number of steps, we're told that Peter was frightened by the wind, and he started to sink. And then he cried out, "Lord, save me." I love that Jesus' response was swift and immediate. He used his hands to reach out and grab Peter, and he said, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" It's like, I got you. After Peter and Jesus get into the boat, that's when the wind stops. The strong wind did not subside until after they were safely in the boat, and not a second before. And the result of all this is everyone in the boat worshiped Jesus, saying, "Oh, you are for sure God's son," which is the very first time the disciples say that in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, there's one phrase of Jesus's in this story that has bothered me for years. I don't know if anyone else caught it. But that phrase, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" I feel like every time I've heard this story taught in church, I've been told that clearly it means Peter failed. Peter took his eyes off Jesus. He was distracted, and Peter's sinking walk of shame demonstrates a failure of faith. Now, the logical ending to this train of thought is that if only Peter hadn't been distracted by the wind, not the waves, curiously, but the wind, he would have made it all the way to Jesus. So I like to imagine, okay, well, what would have happened if that happened? Would they have had a big bro hug out in the middle of the lake? A secret handshake before they walked back to the boat? Would Peter have gotten a slap on the back and a "good job, buddy" from Jesus? I don't know. The more I think about this story, the less satisfied I am with that interpretation. Because for starters, Peter already had doubts way before he put that foot out onto the water. Because he wasn't even really sure that this was Jesus. So he asks a question. And when the wind becomes overwhelming, the words out of his mouth are, "Lord, save me." That doesn't really sound like someone that has no faith to me. But it does sound like a disciple whose faith in Jesus was still little, still learning, still inquiring, still curious. It makes me think of a baby who has just learned that it can roll itself over, but didn't realize it could do that and starts crying, panicked, terrified by what they have just done. Or like the child who panics when they're trying out the swing for the first time and they get overwhelmed by their daring. "Mama, help me." They're testing the waters. Are my parents still there for me? Have they got me still? Peter doubted if this was really Jesus, the one whose voice he literally just heard, and yet Peter still steps out on the water anyways. Peter is still figuring out what faith in Jesus even looks like, still trying to figure out who exactly this Jesus even is. Now, if you look at the totality of the Gospel of Matthew, you'll see this phrase, "you of little faith," come out of Jesus' mouth multiple times as he interacts with his disciples. The great teacher instructing his students in the ways of God's kingdom. One commentator expressed this idea that in the gospel narratives, we should imagine that the disciples have their training wheels on. And I love that image. Maybe if we give them the benefit of the doubt here, viewing them as little ones who still need their training wheels on, maybe that'll give us a little more compassion for their experiences and will help us to read this not as condemnation, but as faith development. After all, having little faith is not necessarily a bad thing. Back in Matthew 17, Jesus tells his disciples, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. Mustard seeds and mustard seed faith are, in fact, faith, even if it's little. So maybe this statement of Jesus is not meant to be a condemnation at all. Maybe it's simply meant to be a recognition of where Peter and the disciples are, still learning what it means to be a follower of Jesus. People who are still trying to figure it out. They still have questions and doubts. And maybe Jesus here is saying, you know, Peter, I get it. You're human. You have questions. I got you. I will love you even through this. Because this is not a story of a man whose faith was broken. This was a story of a man still in progress, still figuring out what it looks like to follow this man, Jesus, still testing out those training wheels. There was a second note that I learned from a commentator from Luther Seminary about Matthew's gospel and overall message of it. Caroline Lewis points out the overarching message of the book of Matthew is Jesus' condemnation not of those who have little faith, but instead those who manipulate those of little faith for their own gains. Those who treat those with little faith as pawns to be controlled rather than developed, and do so in order to build their own power and influence. That is who Jesus condemns in the Gospel of Matthew. The ones who turn those who have little faith into those who are taught to not doubt, to not question, and to not grow into more thoughtful followers of Jesus. These little ones are never given the opportunity to develop in their faith. Their growth is stunted. Because stunted faith, friends, is much easier to control. And if one dares to question or doubt or believe outside the boundaries that have been established for them, then the ones with little faith who've been brave enough to get out of the boat are never allowed back in. So, friends, our work is to be wise enough to allow those amongst us who have little faith the space and the time they need to grow in their understanding and experiences with God. Let us learn how to be wise enough to not lead them astray as they practice their faith for themselves, testing out their faith training wheels. Joy Moore is a professor of preaching at Luther Seminary. She teases out the idea of Peter sinking, all beginning with his fear of the strong winds. And she reminds us we too experience strong winds in terms of the reality of the world we're living in. By strong winds, she means those strong winds that cause us to question, that cause us to doubt, to wonder if God's really there, or cause us to sink into actions defined by our fear. Moore continues to say that we have been and are experiencing strong winds. So let's work really hard to hear these words from Jesus as gentle, not condemning. Because you and I and all of us, we are still on the journey of fully recognizing who God is and what God's good intention is for us in this world. Because hear the good news. If Jesus can make room for Peter's fears and questions and doubts and uncertainties when he's literally standing in front of him, Jesus can make room for ours too. And if Jesus can take the time to soothe the fears of his disciples, reminding them to not be afraid, perhaps we can take heart from those words too. Again, Jesus is not condemning them for being afraid, but reminding them they don't have to fear because he is right there with them. Makes me think of that song, which I think we're going to be singing in a little bit. Jesus calls us o'er the tumult of our life's wild and restless sea. Even if we're afraid, even if we have doubts or questions or are skeptical. And new life beckons to us, to Peter and to all of us, out of our boat of safety and surety and pat answers of faith that we've always known. Instead, Jesus is beckoning us to have an adventure, to take our faith out into the wilderness, to allow us the room to ask questions, to have doubts, to learn firsthand that we won't be left alone after all. Maybe the purpose of all of that is for our little faith to grow, to change, to become different than it is now, to understand more of who Jesus is, to see God with our own eyes. Friends, may it be so that our little faith has room to grow and we have the compassion to give each other room for our training wheels to get tested out. Amen.